With that, I would now like to introduce our very special guest, historian Lorraine McConaghy. Dr. McConaghy is a public historian who has lived in Kirkland since 1980 and did her master thesis at the University of Washington on the Lake Washington shipyards. She has received numerous awards for her exhibits and programs both nationally and locally, and is currently researching Washington's territory, 3rd Governor Richard Holson, who resigned his position to join the Confederate States of America. Let's give Dr. McConaghy a warm welcome.
Wow. Hello. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be introduced in such a wonderful context, and I was so glad that Erica used the noun conversation in her remarks, because that's what this is. I may be standing up here, and there may seem to be a hierarchy to that, but what this is all about is working together to understand the past, doing the hard work of negotiating those arguments and creating kind of a contested but a common narrative that can make this present make sense and help us get into the future. So today we're going to be focused on a case study between 1939 and 1959, which in many cases seems like the sweet spot for nostalgia and sentimentalism about Kirkland character. And I'd like to disorient that notion a bit by looking back to a time when, looking around here, I think very few of us remember 1939 to 1959 with any degree of immediacy. So we're going to be looking at material that may be somewhat unfamiliar, but in a very familiar setting. So we'll be looking at Kirkland's transition from a booming blue-collar industrial boomtown, take that in, to a sleepy backwater and a white-collar residential suburb of Seattle. Very different characters, very different consensus. This isn't a smooth and simple transition from either progress or decline. Nothing works like that. There's lots of transformative, essential events that are bumps in the road or forks in the road that we might take. So the I-90 bridge, the 520 bridge, the GI Bill, Kirkland's adoption of the city manager style of governance, the personal computer, the internet, the COVID pandemic. These are some of the bumps in the road that events that succeed them are contingent on. So history isn't just who, what, when, and where. That's data, right? That's bullet points. History is how and why and so what. What is the significance? What is the meaning? The first paper I ever gave as a graduate student, my moderator said to me, "It's a fine paper, nicely written, well-researched, but so what?" It was hard to hear as a graduate student, but it really changed my life, and it reoriented the work that I do. Significance is meaning. Meaning is significance. We hammer that out together. History is contested ground. I know we all know that. The argument about what is the shared civic narrative and its meaning is a vital responsibility of democracy. It's a thing that we work out all the time, and it's never done. We just keep working at it. But the notion of separate narratives, where there's your narrative and my narrative and your narrative and their narrative, that is not a democratic common narrative. That is Balkanism. So how did the residents of Kirkland and Houghton, starting as a handful of newcomers in the 1850s on native ground and native water, how did they develop exclusionary housing practices by the middle of the 20th century? That's what we're examining today. I'm also interested in kind of working on the development of consensus. It's a very powerful but very slippery entity. How does consensus work iteratively with character? How do they reciprocate with one another? So how does a community change its mind, right? How do we develop a mind and how do we change it? So here in Kirkland and Houghton, we see at the end of the war that a community informed by its local newspapers, Bellevue American East Side Journal, the Rotary, the Chamber of Commerce, elected officials, and other influencers in communities, spiritual communities, other sorts of influence. How do they change Kirkland's mind as dramatically as it does? So this is what a public historian does. You learn from the past to make the present make sense and make better informed choices about the future. It's so simple, but it's not simple-minded, and it's not simplistic. It's a powerful tool for seeing the future. So today we're going to explore jobs, industry, housing, and transportation real quickly. We'll explore the disconnect between policy and practice and the role that your vigilance, my vigilance, has in enforcement and development of that popular consensus, linking policy to practice, linking de jure to de facto. People can make a difference. Ordinary people like us living everyday lives can make a big difference. We're not passive. Learning about history makes the present make sense, helps us make better informed choices. So let's get going. So this is the photo that we used in our publicity. This is Kirkland a century ago, 100 years ago, 1923. And the Kirkland that we know had incorporated in 1905. It was the first town on the east side to incorporate, to get that status, and it was considered the hub of the east side. It was the central place for a far-flung rural and industrial neighborhood district. Kirkland was urban at this time. You could buy a hat, you could get your teeth drilled, you could do a will, you could buy chicken feed. Kirkland was the center of this far-flung hinterland. Kirkland is dry. There's stills in those hills, but Kirkland itself is bone dry. So a century ago, we're looking east here, looking inland up the ferry ramp from the ferry Lincoln. In 1923, the hourly ferry between downtown Kirkland and Madison Park pulsed. People, freight, and a very few cars back and forth across Lake Washington. It was Kirkland's heartbeat, pulsing that blood of crowds through this urban place. And Kirkland was an industrial town at this time. So this is the ferry Lincoln again, but we're not standing on it, we're looking at it being built. This is heavy industry on the shore of Houghton. This is at the site of Carillon Point today. The ferry Lincoln had a steel hull. This is not some flimsy balsa wood construction. This is a steel-hulled ferry with a wooden superstructure, and the shipyard, the Anderson shipyard at that time, worked mostly in wood. The yard was boom and bust. If there's a contract, it's a boom. If there's not, there's a bust. Men, and it was almost exclusively men, walked to work. That was, you worked where you lived. You walked to your work. The point is that this was an industrialized lakeshore where Lake Washington was more of a water highway than a scenic wonder. A shipyard makes sense on a forested lakeshore, and the little steam ferries like the Lincoln, less than 150 feet long, remained on Lake Washington running excursions, acting as waterborne bridges from shore to shore, and their manufacture, maintenance, and operation provided blue-collar jobs. But Kirkland was founded as a blue-collar town, right? We go back to the actual founding of a blue-collar industrial community. Heavy logging and lumber mills cleared and transformed the lake shore. Then British steel tycoon Peter Kirk was visiting the U.S., and a friend, Leigh Hunt of Hunt's Point, persuaded him that the place we now call Kirkland was a good location for a steel railroad rail rolling mill. There was iron and coal to be found in southeast King County and in the Cascades. The Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad ran nearby to bring in supplies and carry out finished product. This mill was built up on the bluff near the current site of Costco. If you've seen Birmingham and Peaky Blinders, you know that a steel foundry was heavy industry, not some sanitized Disneyland experience of the past for which we should be nostalgic or sentimental. And Peter Kirk imagined our town as a company town in the classic Pullman, Illinois model. So he built all the houses, Lakeview homes for the white-collar workers and inland cottages for the blue-collar workers. He built the library, and he filled it with books that would discourage discontent. He built one church to which everyone had to go. He built a company store where the workers bought on company credit. I owe my soul to the company store. There was no tavern at all. The mill was built as you see it here, but it never rolled any rails as the Great Depression of the 1890s swept Kirkland's investors into poverty. But Kirkland was designed to be an industrial town. So the Kirkland woolen mill, and there's other industries we could cite, right? But we don't have all the time in the world. So this is the woolen mill right downtown on the lake. I don't think anything makes clearer that the lake was not seen as a suburban amenity, but rather was seen as an industrial source and a highway. Fulling, dyeing, and weaving wool for blankets and clothing for miners to the Klondike, and then for World War I soldiers. The mill used the water of Lake Washington in its industrial processes. And the mill put these blue-collar Kirkland people to work. They walked to work, and they were blue-collar workers. And this mill persisted into the 1920s. The payroll fluctuated with the market. It's very much a boom and bust economy like Boeing used to be. But as many as 275 men and women worked at this woolen mill. Employment where you live, where you walk to industrial work, is part of Kirkland's DNA from the start. These are the ordinary Kirkland people who made their living working at the woolen mill. So here we see Kirkland in 1930, again, the hub of the East Side. The four-way stop sign here, such a wonderful metaphor, at the head of the ferry off-ramp. The Great Depression has begun, the hungry 30s, when the unemployment rate in Washington state was about 30%. And that is an underestimated percent because women were discouraged from working. Women were told that it was their gendered duty to stay in their homes. A single woman who taught in King County in 1932, if she married, she had to quit her job. If she kept her marriage a secret, she would be fired. Working was a gender prerogative and for single women. You've heard of Hoovervilles in Seattle, yeah? But there were Hoovervilles in Kirkland as well. They were tiny, tiny, tiny. I interviewed a lot of Kirkland people in the 1980s, and a number of them remembered families living in chicken coops, living in abandoned barns, cooking on a campfire outside because they were homeless and jobless and there was nowhere else to go. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal brought jobs to the East Side. The federal policy of the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps, the WPA, the CCC, put people to work, building and repairing roads and bridges, and hiring local boys to go off to Mount Rainier or the Snoqualmie Pass to build hiking trails. So this is an industrial case study of Kirkland. A person could write a book about these things. What's marked here in red is an essential event. Without it, what followed could not have happened, and what followed is contingent on that event. So here we see the lowering of Lake Washington through the Lake Washington Ship Canal, which opened up an industrial water highway from Lake Washington through Lake Union out to Elliott Bay. So you could build much bigger ships on the freshwater lakes and get them out to salt water. And you can read here, I don't need to read it for you, but the other essential event is the Kalakala. This is the Kalakala. This was built in Houghton. This was launched in 1935, and it is just an extraordinary vessel, an extraordinary design. So it's built on a burnt-out ferry hull from San Francisco that was towed up here for $10. And then this extraordinary Art Deco superstructure designed and built on top of it. So those are steel plates that are arc welded together. This was disruptive, innovative technology at the time, and Lake Washington Shipyard was in the forefront with this technology. It really upped the technological game at the Lake Washington shipyard and positioned it well for its future as it continued to grow and continued to industrialize. The Kalakala went into service as an auto ferry on the Seattle-Bremerton run for decades. But for our purposes, she demonstrates that by 1935, Kirkland's shoreline was devoted to sophisticated metal shipbuilding, heavy industry. And a break, I think, between policy and practice is that the New Deal policies of relief and recovery, the WPA, the CCC, in practice were not quite as fair as they were intended to be. Building the Kalakala, I interviewed in oral history interviews that are recorded, 2 men saying that during the Great Depression, they passed bribes through the fence of the shipyard so that the foreman would hire them for the week. That was the way the policy worked out in real life. And this is the transportation housing case study. And again, you could write a book. But the red events here are essential. So the opening of the first Lake Washington Bridge, the I-90 bridge, the second Lake Washington Bridge, the Northern Bridge, created Kingsgate and Queensgate. I mean, those easy transportation where you could go when you wanted, where you wanted, and you didn't have to wait an hour for the ferry. It transformed the East Side. The GI Bill, I'll argue, it was one of the greatest federal, most important federal policies of the 20th century. We'll see Houghton's incorporation in 1948 to get away from Kirkland. It was a defensive incorporation, and it was perceived that way at the time. And then the last Lake Washington ferry, ending the sense of the East Side as the San Juan Islands, living on island time. So this is the I-90 bridge. This is the bridge to the future. This is the bridge that will change everything. You could go when you wanted, you could go where you wanted. Prior to this, getting around was so difficult. So the big governing questions of life is, where do I work? Where do I live? How do I get around? Those are 3 fundamental questions of just the logistics of life. This changed everything. Again, in the 1980s, and who can assess the typicality of this? But I talked with an elderly man who, when he was young, like 18, 19, lived in Bellevue on Northup Way, what we would call Northup Way today, and he walked to work at the mines in Newcastle every Sunday night, and he would come back every Saturday morning. So he would live where he worked, but his home was in Bellevue. And to get back and forth, he walked what was called the Newcastle Road or the Newcastle Trail, depending on who you talk to. This bridge changed everything, and one of the big things it changes was to encourage automobility. As a bus rider, I find it extremely difficult to navigate, more difficult than it was 25 years ago, to navigate public transportation to and from Kirkland and the places that I need to go. This bridge and then the 1963 bridge to its north put East Siders into their automobiles and made garages an essential part of construction. Before that, that was not the case. So I've mentioned policy versus practice. Here are 6 examples, and this is the interpretation, this is the so what, the how and why of the who, what, when, and where stories I'll be telling you. So, bribes paid, internment of American citizens without trial during World War II. Navy cost-plus contracts plagued by constant scandals of overmanning and excessive purchase of goods. Federal housing restricted by county policy to white renters here in Kirkland. Labor union membership required by federal contracts at the Lake Washington shipyard, but in actual practice restricted by the labor unions themselves to for the duration workers who would lose their union membership at the end of the war. And then finally, the GI Bill. So, I've noted World War II internment of people of Japanese descent as a perversion of policy. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Eastsiders who had wanted Japanese farmers, fishermen, and managers to disappear had excuses to call for their removal. It was rumored that Japanese farmers had planted their crops in arrows when they grew up, pointed at the Boeing plant, pointed at Lake Washington Shipyard, pointed at Associated Shipbuilding on Harbor Island, and that they were radioing information to Japanese ships offshore. So the idea that Issei and Nisei were spies became a handy and untested in any kind of court of law accusation to make against the people of Japanese descent among whom we lived. Issei, first-generation Japanese immigrants, were forbidden by policy to become citizens. I think that's kind of hard to get your head around, that policy would dictate such a thing. Policy also forbade the Issei ownership. So the farms that they farmed on the east side, they did not own, they leased. The Nisei, second generation, were born in the United States, and they were born under the Constitution with the freedoms that ought to convey. Nevertheless, all Japanese were removed, not just from Kirkland, but from the whole coastal corridor down through California and even into Mexico, and removed inland to internment camps. The only passenger train in 30 years to go through Kirkland was the train that removed people of Japanese descent from our town. I blurred this out because it doesn't really matter what the details are. What this is an appeal from the mobilized defense industries of World War II to people all over the United States to come to where the jobs were, whether that was California or Washington or wherever else, Richland or Kirkland. So there's this huge mass migration in 1941-42. And I don't think people think about it. It's much bigger than the westward movement of the 1860s. 1 million men and women went into uniform, and 1 million men and women became soldiers of production. They went on the road in response to advertisements like this to come to mobilize defense industries. The Great Depression ended overnight. There were more jobs than there were people to fill them. And the thousands who responded to this, they were recruited as soldiers of production. Your nation needs your help. So there's a sort of confluence of personal, yes, I would like to have a job, and yes, when I get that job, I'm going to be assisting my country in winning this war in which we were attacked. So newcomers arrived in Kirkland by the thousands. They came in pickup trucks. They hitchhiked here. They walked here sometimes from Portland or Vancouver. They knew there were jobs, and they entered into the shipyard training programs that were in the old Tradewell Market down in Kirkland here. Kind of an important figure to remember. Building the Kalakala, 300 men. By 1942, 8,500 men and women. So from 300 to 8,500 in 5 years. It's just an amazing sea change here. The U.S. Navy issued contracts to the Lake Washington Shipyard for anti-submarine net tenders, and we can talk about later what that means, and seaplane tenders. So Boeing is building the seaplanes, warplanes, down the lake. And the shipyard's building these floating machine shops. I mean, that's what the tenders really were, that serviced the seaplanes and acted as escorts, naval escorts, fast, lethal, vigilant. The military contracts were cost plus, and this is a nice phrase to bear in mind. What it means is that the shipyard was reimbursed for every penny of its cost, and the profit that it earned was a fixed percentage of those costs. So, yeah, I mean, you can see the invitation to fraud here. And Boeing, Lake Washington Shipyard, every mobilized defense industry you can think of was accused of overmanning, was accused of overbuying in order to drive up the cost of the costs and therefore drive up the profit in the end. And the other policy aspect of this is that if you had a Navy contract or a federal contract, you had to hire union labor. I mean, Roosevelt is still president. He's a very, very labor-forward president. And he said, You want to mobilize Lake Washington shipyards? Great. Your boilermakers, your electricians, your sheet metal workers, your machinists, everyone has to belong to a union. But policy and practice are different things. And in actual practice, the policy of the United States government was perverted by restrictive, exclusionary practice. So this is a publication that the U.S. Navy paid for at the Lake Washington shipyard on the ways. So a ways is what you slide a ship down. As you're building it up, you slide it down the ways into the water. This is Christmas of 1942, and the iconography here is very powerful. Santa Claus is depicted wearing a shipyard hard hat and overalls with an employee badge and is about to stuff a seaplane tender into Uncle Sam's stocking. And the foreground, sort of, it's a huge mobilized defense industry that represents the Lake Washington shipyard. But the shipyards represented Santa for Kirkland, too. The wartime boomtown payroll really took off in 1941 and grew throughout the war. New clothing stores, groceries, bakeries, barbershops, beauty shops, furniture stores, taverns, card rooms, restaurants. A Kirkland attorney, whose name I wish I knew, devoted his entire practice to handling divorces that arose in the shipyard as women finally made enough money that they could get out of a bad relationship. Rosie the Riveter had laundry services. Rosie the Riveter could buy takeout meals during the war. Kirkland boomed on the home front. There was a daycare center in Kirkland that was a Lanham Act that was funded and staffed by the federal government for Rosie and her kids. In 1942, the Kirkland City Council authorized a zoning ordinance encouraging the construction of more shipyards, more steel mills, more machine shops, any heavy industry that would continue to build this payroll. This is not a high-quality image. I took this directly from an On the Ways. I've never found it in the Navy archives, but you can kind of make it out. It's a wartime photo that shows the extent of the Lake Washington shipyards. If you were imagining the little tiny shipyard that built the Lincoln, you were right. It was like it was very, very small. This is very, very big. And we're looking here west across Lake Washington. You can see the tip of Yarrow Point. You can see quite a bit of Hunts Point here. This headline also provides the patriotic, defensive motivation for long hours and dirty hard work. But what's important is just how big this has become. The seaplane tenders were 3 times as big as the ferry Lincoln in every direction, up, down, side to side. The shipyard boomed as it mobilized for war, and the Bellevue American was a newspaper as important as the East Side Journal, and it editorialized, "There's plenty of work for everyone at good wages at the shipyard." Here we see a crowd of shipyard workers clocking out of the office at the end of their shift. They're about to be searched. So much was rationed on the home front: tires, shoes, sugar, ball bearings, copper, liquor, cigarettes, everything you want, that it was tempting to steal what you couldn't buy. And you were surrounded by it at the shipyard. One oral history narrator that I interviewed remembered someone on this line was living in a garage, paying rent to rent the garage, and he wanted an electric light in the worst way, and the garage was not electrified. So he stole enough wire at the shipyard and wrapped it around and around and around his body, and he's online here, waiting to be searched. And he fainted online because it was so hot, wearing all this wire. It's kind of a cool story. But I think this image gives you some sense of what 8,500 men and women working 3 shifts a day was like. But this is Boeing. This is not the shipyard. But it gives an even greater sense, I think, of that dense, exciting home front. This is the day that the production line at Boeing switched over from the B-17 to the B-29. And so it's a day of tremendous change. No matter how wide our lens might be, you'd see more people. Boeing was just booming during World War II, producing more than one plane a day. But what I want you to look at is the camouflage on the building. Yeah, so you can see the camouflage on the side of the building, but you can just glimpse at the tippy top the trees. So the whole of Plant 2 and the parking lots were covered with canvas that had cow backs and treetops and rooftops painted on them so that it looked like Kent or a country town and didn't look like a shipyard at all. So it's amusing, but it really drives home the sense that the East Side and Seattle saw themselves as ground zero. That if there were going to be an attack after Pearl Harbor, it would likely be here. So back to Lake Washington Shipyard. We're looking here across Yarrow Bay at Yarrow Point and Hunts Point. And I want to talk a little bit about the water in Yarrow Bay, because I don't think anything kind of brings home what a bad neighbor this mobilized defense industry became. So there was a chemist here from Washington State, and he was doing buoyancy tests in Yarrow Bay. And he had an Erlenmeyer flask, and he filled it with water from the lake, and he said, "My God, this is almost pure urine." And it was. The crises of sewage during World War II, there were waves of diphtheria, there were waves of, not cholera exactly, but diarrhea kinds of diseases, because the water was so impure. The E. coli in Kirkland drinking water in 1944 was 5 times the permissible average, and people had to boil their drinking water in order to drink it safely. Out on the end of the outfitting dock here was a 16-hole outhouse. And that just went straight into the water. And there were lots of informal urinations as well, I'm sure. So the shipyard is a difficult neighbor, and you can probably think about how that might be. But it's sewage. It's also 3 shifts a day, and all the noise associated with that. The ship's dumping oily bilge and just oil over the sides of the ship, cutting fluids like trichloroethylene and toluene into the lake, the roar of whistles, chippers, compressors, huge engines, day in, day out, and the influx of strangers, the other, the newcomers. Women. Women were not particularly welcome as newcomers in the shipyard. You look at the Hollywood musicals of World War II and you think, oh, everybody loved Rosie the Riveter. Well, the Boilermakers 104 did not. They did not want to admit women to their ranks. They only admitted women for the duration. And women were trained in one specific skill at Boeing or in the shipyards, and that is what they did repetitively. So what's being argued here is the gender of the woman who is successful in the shipyard. I interviewed 2 guys in the 80s who said women who did well in the shipyard were lesbians. They wore their wallets in their back pockets just like a man. And at that time, that was a heavy, heavy insult to make. There were other women who were less, who were different than that. One woman I interviewed was an electrician, and she wanted to become a shop steward. And the only way to do that was to work her way up in the skills hierarchy. So you had these tests you had to do where you had to wire boards, different kinds of boards in different kinds of ways, and get your supervisor to approve what you had done. So she finished her board, went to get her supervisor, brought him back, and all the wires had been clipped on her board, and a dirty picture put on the board where the wiring was done. The closer you got to the ships, the more intense this harassment was. The closer you were to the offices, the less so. So this guy can't tell the difference between a man and a woman, and there were no restrooms at Lake Washington Shipyard, so it's sort of a funny cartoon in so many ways. For racial minorities, and again, you know this is a crummy picture because it came directly out of the publication. For racial minorities, work at the Lake Washington Shipyard was in some cases the best job they'd ever had in their lives. You could earn more than $1 an hour to start, and then the wages went up after that. $60 a week paychecks to take home. At the time, this was phenomenal. And there was not that much to spend the money on. So much was rationed that you could buy, bonds, buy war bonds, and do the sort of enforced saving. Or you could go to the movies, or you could buy beer. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot you could spend money on. And for people of color to be admitted to blue-collar jobs, this was wonderful. And the unions were required to accept them, but for the duration was the way that policy turned out in practice. People of color were about 8% of the shipyard. Women were about 15% of the shipyard. I was doing an interview for my thesis 40 years ago with an African-American man in the Rainier Valley who had worked as a painter in the Painters Union at the Lake Washington shipyard. It was the best job he had ever had in his life. And at the end of the war, his union membership lapsed. And we were sitting there in his living room conversing, and he was just increasingly emotional about how much he missed having that kind of pride in his work, that having a really good paycheck meant. And he asked me to leave. He said, I can't talk about this with you. And what lingers in one's mind is the with you part. But that was the best job he had had in his life. What was he doing? He was painting the camouflage on these ships. So the hierarchy of skill in the shipyard, enforced by the union, was that the white worker sketched the outlines of this camouflage, and the black worker spray painted it in. And the spray painting was dirty. It was you ended up breathing in the spray, but that was the hierarchy of skill. So where were all these people living? Do you recognize Lakeview Terrace? I hope you do. This is just west of Metropolitan Market in Houghton. And this was the equivalent of Peter Kirk's white-collar housing. This is white-collar housing. Bungalows, single-family bungalows for architects, engineers, the white-collar workers of the shipyard. Kirkland city limits have changed a lot through time, right? So the intimate city limits of Kirkland at this time, there's only 2,300 or so people living. But the hinterland, the sort of the area of influence of Kirkland is much, much larger than that, 10 to 12,000 people. But with the shipyard employing 8,500, it almost doubled the population of Kirkland's hinterland. It was a huge, huge thing. Newcomers, like during the Great Depression, lived in chicken coops, garages. There's a family in Kirkland that put all their kids out in tents in the yard so they could rent their bedrooms out. People slept wherever they could, and some of them slept in their pickup trucks. And the federal government was obligated itself to build housing for the soldiers of production. This is Stewart Heights, and some of you may remember this, but this is where Northwest University is today, on 106th Avenue. This is 1,500 families in housing that was built in less than 6 weeks. The walls between the apartments were tar paper. A woman I talked to said you could hear people breathing if they breathed heavily in the room next door to you. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. So Stewart Heights, 1,500 families. The local consensus, however that is developed and determined, was that newcomers were lazy, ignorant, and dirty, that they were trained to do one job at the shipyard, and they couldn't do anything more than that, and they had to do it repetitively or they'd screw it up. So Stewart Heights became known as Stupid Heights. And it's a satirical comment that's so powerful. It is so meaningful. The consensus was that the people who lived in Stupid Heights were Okies and Arkies from Oklahoma and Arkansas who had come here to flee the Dust Bowl. Stupid Heights people, it was said in satire, didn't know what a toilet was, so they washed their feet in the toilet. They framed Grandpa's picture with the toilet seat, because what else would you do with it? They peed in coffee cans and tossed the pee out the back door. They gathered firewood up on the hill there and tried to build fires in the ovens of their electric stove because they didn't know any better. They drank and they brawled and they boxed and they went to cockfights and they went to boxing matches. And the East Side Journal and some faith communities called them Kirkland's newest citizens. But many Kirkland people didn't agree, and Stuart Heights people remained the other for the entire time they lived here. But a most important for our purposes, discontinuity between policy and practice, is that the federal government required this housing, as skimpy as it was, to be available to workers of color and their families at the Lake Washington shipyard. In Seattle, the housing projects were integrated racially, where people worked at Boeing. But here, the King County Housing Authority administered these units, and the King County Housing Authority refused to rent other than white. So here we have, again, where practice and policy diverge from one another. So the 8% of the shipyard that was black lived in Seattle and came back and forth by bus and ferry. This is a rather risque entertainment at the Lake Washington shipyard. The wartime boomtown was a work hard, play hard place. Kirkland never really became a wide open town like Seattle was, where First Avenue was too tough for military men to go on leave sometimes, at times. But Kirkland did do its best. There was a rooming house for sailors waiting for their seaplane tender to be ready. And they contributed to the rowdiness of this town. There was also another boarding house for single men. It was a very masculine culture. It was wild. Bar rooms, card rooms, cockfights, gambling, slots, poker, craps games, and at least 2 brothels. And this is documented. This is not just gossip. Liquor sales tripled in Kirkland in 1 year between 1941 and 1942, and it just went up from there. The deposits in the First National Bank in Kirkland increased 500% during the war. The wartime home front changed Kirkland dramatically. This isn't Kirkland, this is downtown Seattle. This is September 2nd, 1945, the day the war ended, VJ Day. You can see the jubilation here. What did it mean in Kirkland? It meant the cancellation of every Navy contract overnight, which meant the end of the shipyard overnight. What would happen now? The yard finished the seaplane tenders that were on the ways, outfitted 1 destroyer, and that was that. Because of the cost-plus contracts, ownership had done very well during the war, and they were not pursuing constructing fishing vessels or anything like that. They wanted to sell the shipyard. For the newcomers to the shipyard, all of their union cards lapsed too. So for the duration, members of the Painters Union couldn't paint the GI Bill houses that we know are about to happen. And members of the Electricians Union couldn't wire those houses, as we know are about to happen. The Boilermakers 104 reporter, it's a great editorial. They said, shipbuilding is like a basketball game. And the first string of the team had to go to war, to go into uniform. They went to the real front. So the second string came in. That's all you women from your kitchen, and that's all you Okies and Arkies and men and women of color, but now the first string's back. And it's time for the second string to sit down again. So it's that metaphor of a game. So housing crisis, is it not a constant in our story? The GI Bill is going to change everything, but in this political cartoon, syndicated Ding Darling, the soldier is home from the war. He's gotten married, he's got a baby boom baby, and they're living in a foxhole that he's dug with his entrenching tool because they have nowhere else to go. And there just was this huge return of veterans with no place to live. So the GI Bill is very important for the East Side, and I won't read you what this says because you can read that for yourself. But it was one of the most profoundly important federal policies of the past century. It remade America by opening the trap door into the middle class for those who were able to walk through it. Everything you see here was available to veterans, but it was only available in practice to white veterans by and large. And it was another place where policy was perverted by practice. What this permitted was the building of generational wealth, where you could buy a house in Lake Hills, let's say, in 1959 and hold on to it until 2023 and have bought it for $9,500 back in the day and have it worth a great deal more than that. So it isn't just getting a house, it's getting into generational wealth that the GI Bill represented. But it was made very difficult for black home seekers. There are racial covenants and deeds, there's redlining, there's maps that realtors use that showed the red line districts where you'll be comfortable here, but you wouldn't be comfortable in Laurelhurst, and you wouldn't be comfortable in Houghton. You'd be comfortable in the Rainier Valley. That's where you would be comfortable in. So it's no coincidence that the first black family to move into Lake Hills, the homeowner had been an officer of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. And here in Kirkland in 1950, one of the first homeowners to move here, the Yarboroughs, Letcher Yarborough had been president of the NAACP in Seattle. These were articulate, well-educated men and women of color who were able to confront exclusionary racist practices. So take a look at this ad from the East Side Journal. The only thing that would make it better is if it had a garage. It's kind of interesting that it doesn't. But here you see the ideal family. And this is like a pay and save. It's a hardware store saying you can plan a dream home. And it's planning because the whole economy has to readjust from wartime production to peacetime consumer production, and it's going to take some time. So you can make plans, but you can't actually do this yet. But look at this nuclear family. This guy does not work at the shipyard. He's not wearing overalls. He's wearing a business suit. And he's a suburban guy who's going to go to work at Boeing in Renton or in downtown Seattle. His wife isn't Rosie the Riveter anymore. She's wearing a dress and she's going to be at home polishing the linoleum floor. And this is their home, and it's a white future, and it's an elite suburban residential future. So the shipyard, which had been a boom, became a blight. And it really is a blight at this point. The buildings became derelict. The Navy naively said, oh, we know what we can do. We'll moor 300 warships in Yarrow Bay. What do you think? We'll dredge it out and we'll make it bigger and we'll put floating docks and we'll put 300 ships there and we'll have a repair facility at Lake Washington Shipyard that'll employ 2,000 people. And maybe we'll create an Annapolis of the West there, a U.S. Naval Academy. And Kirkland said, yes, please. And Houghton said, oh, no, 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 no. We need to get rid of the shipyard. And this is a political cartoon in the Seattle Times that really, there's a lot going on in this political cartoon. But you can see in Yarrow Bay, which is covered with black oil, oily, tarry oil, you can see the ships. You can see the bilge being dumped over the sides of the ships into Yarrow Bay. You can see the guy in the foreground scraping off the oil from his legs because he's been foolish enough to go swimming. In the middle on the left, it says, welcome to beautiful Lake Washington, where beautiful has been crossed out. So Lake Washington changed its nature. It had been the ideal place for industry. It had become the ideal place for an elite, upwardly mobile residential suburb in a new vision of the future. That residential future did not include Issei and Nisei returning from the internment camps. This poster was posted all over the East Side. You see that the meeting was held in Bellevue, but it attracted hundreds of attendees from Redmond, Kirkland, Renton, Bellevue, Issaquah, who did not want the Japanese to return. And this was so shocking that it made, I can't remember, I tried to figure it out. It's either Newsweek or Time magazine, one of the national news magazines. That's where I ran across it. In my work in Bellevue, and I have not done this in Kirkland, of the 27 families of Japanese descent that farmed prior to the war, only 3 returned. after internment because it was such a bitter, bitter experience. And this is a racial covenant in a deed in Juanita. And, you know, you can look at deeds. You can't look online, but you can look on microfilm at the King County Archives and just go through the deeds. I mean, we really need to do the work and build this up. This is from Jim Gregory's website at the UW, but there's many, many more. So this racial covenant, this exclusionary restriction, explicitly prohibits sale to people not of the Caucasian race. And those are Jews, those are Asians, those are African Americans. However the consensus is defined, however it's determined, however it's developed, Kirkland and Houghton were intended to be white, and exclusion was practiced here. I wanted to put a face on exclusion at the beginning of the 1950s. This is Arlene Yarbrough. She is the wife of the man who was the president of the NAACP in Seattle. She's done many interviews. I'm not sure where Joan McBride is. There she is. One with Joan McBride, held at the Kirkland Heritage Society. Louita, where are you? Louita Hawkinson is representing the Kirkland Heritage Society here today. If you're interested in history, talk with her. There's lots to do. It's not like we're done or anything like that. She and her husband had married and lived in Seattle, and they had a dream of living on the water. They wanted to live on Lake Washington. But she said in her interview with Joan that she knew realtors wouldn't show them homes. They would come up with excuses, so she made appointments and the realtor wouldn't show up. So they decided to just drive around and look for little signs, house for sale, where an individual was selling their home. So that's how they found the house on 16th Street that they bought here in Kirkland. They paid for it in cash. They did not use the GI Bill. She found that there was a petition being circulated among her neighbors to have them removed. This is what it was like. And I think you can see in her sunny, optimistic face what it took to fight back against this perversion of the GI Bill and of the policy that it represented. So the last ferry, boy, this is going to change everything. Everyone's going to become automobile dependent. Men who worked at Davis Wright Tremaine in downtown Seattle or at Boeing in Renton, their wives were at home. There's this huge boom in driving schools because women had never driven and they needed to drive if they were going to be at home on the East Side. Automobility was now required. Bellevue, Kirkland, Houghton, our histories are intertwined. There's no getting around it. So you see here Bellevue incorporating in 1953. Remember, Kirkland had incorporated in 1905. This is a happy day, I suppose, for Bellevue. But they are going to find Medina and Hunts Point incorporating just like Houghton did, a defensive incorporation to get away from Bellevue. So the lakefront communities perceived themselves as elite residential suburbs that would be different. And it's hard to think of it this way, but Bellevue was really considered to be a kind of a vulgar middle-class post-war town where Lake Hills was their vision of suburbs. And that was actually outside the city limits, but you get my point. So just like Stewart Heights was called Stupid Heights, Lake Hills was called Fake Hills. And it was Bellevue's Levittown. And again, just different perspectives, different points of view. But we leave behind Kirkland's dream of a big payroll based on blue-collar industry. So fast forward to today, this is where the Lake Washington shipyard is today, Carillon Point. And back in the 80s, when this was on the drawing board, it was originally called the shipyard. But the Skinner Development Corporation found that to be too vulgar. So it was named for a heritage that was completely bogus, you know. Put a Carillon in, why not? I think an important thing to remember in terms of our contingencies is the change in 1965 in governance in Kirkland to a city manager style of government 1965, where it wasn't just the good old boys who were mayors who ran the town, but people with professional training who administered the community. And Al Locke was the first of those city managers, and it is he who insisted that the shipyard remain, its scope and its breadth remain visible, and that it not be cut up into little condominium wedges, like most of Kirkland's shoreline was. So we have Al Locke to thank for this remarkable place. This is Lakeview Terrace. I was talking to a new friend about maybe getting one of these bungalows landmarked. I mean, it's 1942. It's not like it's yesterday. But this, I mean, not unfortunately, this is the university. This is where Stuart Heights was, and we just have to imagine it. But what you can do, and I do it often, is walk down the old Stuart Heights stairway. If you go down 60th Street and just head to the water, it's stairway, path, and it takes you to work like it took the Stuart Heights men and women. So a mixed-use lakefront development, a quiet neighborhood of bungalows, and a college campus, a very different character than their wartime uses. So this is what we've reviewed today, what we've gone through, what's been my task, and now it comes to us. There was a conspiracy of silence that allowed policy to be perverted in practice. What was missing there? What permitted that to happen? What do we need? Journalistic attention. We need vigilance. We need to be aware. We need public involvement. That's what this is about today. And we need enforcement, because all of these policies were law, but they were all disregarded. I think it's important, out of respect for you, to tell you what my sources were. And I know this is up here really fast, but if you want, my thesis at the University of Washington on the shelves there has everything written out very clearly. I've done more work since then, thank God, but this is sort of it. So this is where we are, and I want to just close by reminding you that what you heard today is not data or bullet points, not who, what, when, and where, but how and why and what does it mean and so what. That's the hard part of history. That's why there's a disclaimer on this presentation. It's risky back there. History is disorienting. It's not what we think it was. When people talk about, oh, the character of Kirkland, they're often talking about being young themselves, right? And I moved here in 1980. I know what it was like because it was fresh for me. I had just come here. And not all of my memories of Kirkland in 1980 are of my happy little town where nobody locked their doors and everyone knew everybody else. Life's not like that. History is dangerous. That's why we need to work on it together. It makes the present make more sense. That's why these partners are here today, is to invite your involvement in figuring out what the future might be for a livable East Side. And I'm happy, I'll hang around. You're going to hear some really important material coming up here, but I'll hang around too. Thank you very much.